You have been deceived. For years, you've been handed the same excuse over and over from the same kind of person, and you've accepted it every single time. They're just busy. Work has been crazy. Life gets in the way. You've repeated this sentence to yourself so often, it stopped sounding like an excuse and started sounding like a fact. Here is the truth nobody wants to say out loud. Busy is not a permanent condition. It's a season, and seasons end. If someone has never texted you first in months, in years, through calm weeks and quiet weekends and slow holidays where nothing else was demanding their attention, busy was never the real reason. It was just the nicest word available for something much simpler. You were not the priority. This isn't a video about being paranoid or reading too much into silence. It's about a pattern so common, so widely accepted, that almost nobody stops to examine it honestly. People show you exactly where you rank in their life, constantly, through the smallest and most ordinary actions, and one of the clearest signals available is also one of the easiest to ignore: who reaches out first and who waits. Let's take a clear, honest look at what that pattern actually means and why the busy excuse has survived so long despite almost never holding up under real scrutiny. Everyone is busy. That part is true, and it's exactly why busy makes such a convenient excuse. Nobody can argue with it directly because everyone has a job, a family, responsibilities pulling at their time from every direction. But here's what the busy excuse conveniently ignores. Being busy has never actually stopped anyone from doing the things that matter to them. Think about it honestly. The busiest people you know still find time to check scores from a game they care about. They still reply within minutes to a message from someone they're excited about. They still make time for a hobby, a show, a person who feels important enough to prioritize. Busy has never been about available hours. It's about where those hours go once they exist. And hours always go toward whatever ranks highest on the list, whether anyone admits that list exists or not. This is the part that stings, but it's worth sitting with anyway. A text takes 10 seconds. Not 10 minutes, 10 seconds. Nobody on earth is so busy that 10 seconds never once appeared available across weeks or months. What actually happened is simpler and less comfortable to admit. In each of those available 10-second windows, reaching out to you simply didn't make the list. So if it's not about time, what is it actually about? Why do some people so reliably wait to be reached out to, no matter how much time passes, no matter how many opportunities exist? For some people, it really is indifference, plain and simple. You are not a priority, and there's no deeper mystery underneath that fact. But for a lot of people, the real reason is something quieter, something that looks like distance from the outside but is actually closer to fear. Reaching out first carries a small but real risk. It means being the one who wanted something. It means the possibility of being ignored, of sending a message into silence, of feeling exposed for a moment before knowing whether the interest is returned. Some people build their entire communication style around avoiding that risk completely. They'll respond warmly, generously even, once you've done the work of reaching out first. But they'll never take the first step themselves, because taking it means briefly standing in a position where they might not matter as much as they hoped. Waiting protects them from that feeling. If you always initiate, they never have to find out what happens when they don't. This distinction matters because it changes what the pattern actually tells you. Indifference means you're simply not valued enough to bother. Fear-based waiting means something different, that the person cares at some level, but has organized their entire approach to closeness around never being vulnerable first. Either way, the result looks identical from where you're standing. You're always the one reaching, and they're always the one waiting to see if you will. Picture how this actually plays out with someone caught in the fear-based version of this pattern. They'll respond to your message within minutes, warm, engaged, clearly happy to be talking to you. The conversation flows easily once it starts. If you stop there, You'd have every reason to assume the relationship was healthy and mutual, but notice what never happens on its own. The next conversation, days later, also starts with your message, not theirs. And the one after that. Every single exchange technically goes well. The problem isn't the quality of the conversations, it's that none of them exist without you starting them first, every single time, indefinitely. This is often the most confusing version of the pattern to recognize, precisely because everything that does happen feels good. There's no coldness in the actual messages, no short replies, no obvious sign of disinterest once the conversation is underway. The absence is quieter than that. It lives entirely in what never happens, the message that never arrives on its own, the check-in that never comes without being prompted first. That kind of absence is easy to miss for years because there's nothing dramatic to point to. There's just a pattern repeating itself so consistently that it eventually becomes the whole relationship, disguised as a perfectly pleasant one. Here's where it gets important to be precise, because not every case of someone waiting for you to text first is actually a problem. There's a real difference between a temporary situational quiet and a permanent pattern, and confusing the two leads people to either overreact to something harmless or underreact to something that's been quietly telling them the truth for years. A temporary quiet has an obvious cause and an obvious end. Someone going through a genuinely brutal work week, a family emergency, a hard personal season might go quiet for a stretch and then return to normal once that specific thing passes. If you can point to the exact reason and that reason has a visible edge, a deadline, a recovery, an ending, that's not the pattern this video is describing. A permanent pattern has no edge. It's been true across different seasons, different jobs, different circumstances, for as long as you've known this person. Busy season ends, and they still don't reach out first. Slow season arrives, weekends open up, holidays stretch on with nothing to do, and still, nothing changes. This is the version worth paying attention to because it's not describing a temporary circumstance anymore. It's describing a consistent choice, made quietly, over and over, regardless of what else is happening in their life. This pattern shows up differently depending on where it lives, and it's worth looking at each version clearly because the excuse changes shape depending on the relationship. In friendships, it often gets dressed up as, "That's just how they are." Some people simply aren't texters, the story goes, as if texting was some rare, specialized skill certain people were never taught. But watch what that same friend does with someone new, a new partner, a new close friend they're excited about. The texting skill they supposedly never had suddenly appears, fluent and constant, the moment the person on the other end feels important enough. That's usually all the proof needed. The skill was never missing. The priority was. In dating, it often gets dressed up as playing it cool or not wanting to seem too eager. But genuine interest and constant silence rarely coexist for long. Someone who's actually excited about you finds it hard to resist reaching out, not because they lack self-control, but because wanting to talk to you outweighs the small risk of seeming interested. A pattern of never initiating stretched across weeks of dating usually isn't restraint. It's a quiet, ongoing answer to a question you haven't asked out loud yet. In family relationships, it often gets dressed up as, "That's just how our family communicates." A parent or sibling who never calls first, who only responds when reached, gets protected by decades of that being framed as simply the family culture. But culture explains a pattern shared by everyone in the family equally. It doesn't explain why one specific relationship within that family carries all the initiating weight, while another, with a different sibling or a different parent, flows easily in both directions. Modern life has made this pattern easier to hide than ever before, which is exactly why so many people miss it for years. We live in a culture obsessed with being busy, where exhaustion has become a kind of status symbol, something people almost compete over. "I haven't had a free moment in weeks" has become a normal thing to say proudly rather than a red flag worth examining. This culture gives the busy excuse endless cover because everyone is performing the same exhaustion, and nobody wants to be the one who points out that performance doesn't actually explain a pattern stretching across years. This modern obsession with busyness lets people off the hook for something that used to be much harder to hide. In an earlier time, with fewer distractions competing for attention, a friend or partner who consistently failed to reach out would have stood out clearly against everyone else who did. Now, everyone can plausibly claim exhaustion because everyone genuinely is a little exhausted all the time by everything. The excuse blends into the background noise instead of standing out as the specific personal choice it actually is. The real cost of accepting this excuse without question is that it trains you to explain away a clear signal instead of trusting it. You start doing the work the other person should be doing themselves, constructing reasons on their behalf, giving them credit for effort they never actually made. Meanwhile, the actual information sitting right in front of you, who reaches out and who doesn't, gets buried under a mountain of generous assumptions you built entirely on your own. A fair objection deserves a fair answer here. What about people who are genuinely just not big texters? Isn't it possible someone cares deeply and simply isn't wired for constant messaging, without that meaning anything about how much you matter to them? Yes, this is real, and it's worth separating from the pattern this video is describing. Some people, often people who lean more introverted or who simply find phones draining, communicate less overall to everyone, not just to you. The key word there is everyone. If someone rarely initiates with anyone in their life, not just with you, that's a genuine communication style, not a specific signal about your place in it. You can usually confirm this by watching how they interact with other people close to them. If they're just as quiet with their closest friends, their family, everyone, the low texting pattern is simply who they are, and it's worth respecting rather than reading into. The pattern actually worth paying attention to looks different. It's selective. The same person who never texts you first somehow manages to text other people first constantly, reaches out easily to a different friend, initiates plans with someone else without any apparent effort. When the low initiating pattern is universal, it's a personality trait. When it's specific to you, while flowing easily elsewhere in their life, it stops being about their communication style and starts being information about where you actually rank. So how do you actually tell the difference between a real temporary busy season and a permanent, quiet pattern you've been excusing for too long? Here's a simple way to look at it clearly without relying on guesswork or vague feelings. The first step is tracking the pattern honestly over real time instead of judging it one moment at a time. Don't ask, did they text me this week? Ask, over the last 3 months, who initiated more often, me or them? Most people have never actually counted because counting feels petty, almost embarrassing. But a rough count over a real stretch of time cuts through the fog of individual excuses far better than any single week ever could. One quiet week means nothing. 3 straight months of you initiating almost every single conversation means something. The second step is testing it directly without announcing the test. Simply stop reaching out first for a defined period, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and watch what actually happens. This isn't a manipulation tactic. It's information gathering, plain and simple. If the relationship goes completely silent the moment you stop initiating, that silence is the answer you were looking for, delivered far more honestly than any explanation the other person could offer you directly. If they notice the shift and reach out on their own, that's useful information too, in the opposite direction. The third step is paying attention to what happens during genuinely available time, not just busy time. Everyone has some obvious excuse during a hectic week. Watch what happens during a slow one, a holiday, a weekend with clearly nothing going on, visible through their own social media or their own words about having a quiet couple of days. If busy was really the barrier, a slow period should show a different pattern. If the silence continues right through the slow period exactly the same as it did during the busy one, busy was never actually the barrier at all. Here's what this can look like in practice. Say you scroll back 3 months and count 40 total conversations. If you started 36 of them and they started 4, that's not a coincidence, and it's not a run of bad luck across 90 days. That's a 90% to 10% split, consistent enough to rule out randomness. Compare that to a friend where the count comes out close to even, 22 to 18, say. That kind of near balance, even if it's not perfectly 50-50, describes a mutual relationship with normal, natural variation. The first number is a pattern. The second number is just how relationships actually look most of the time. A couple of mistakes are worth naming before you act on any of this. The first is doing the count once, during an unusually busy or unusually quiet stretch, and treating that single snapshot as the full picture. A fair count needs real range, ideally 2 or 3 months, to smooth out the normal variation that any relationship naturally has. The second mistake is confusing a slow starter with a non-starter. Some people take longer to warm up to initiating contact early in a relationship or friendship and genuinely start reaching out more once real trust has built. If the relationship is new, give it real time before treating the early pattern as permanent. The pattern this video describes is specifically about people who've had plenty of time to change and simply haven't. Once you've gathered this information honestly, it's worth being clear about what to actually do with it, because collecting evidence without acting on it just leaves you back where you started, only now with more proof of something you're still choosing to ignore. If the pattern turns out to be temporary, tied to a real, visible circumstance, the answer is simple. Be patient, the way you'd want someone to be patient with you during your own hard season, and expect the normal rhythm to return once that circumstance passes. This isn't the situation this video is warning you about. If the pattern turns out to be permanent, the answer requires more honesty than most people are willing to give themselves. It means accepting that the relationship, as it currently exists, reflects an actual imbalance, not a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared up with one more conversation. You can choose to accept that imbalance and continue the relationship exactly as it is, with open eyes instead of convenient excuses. You can choose to bring it up directly, clearly, without accusation, simply naming what you've noticed and seeing how it's received. Or you can choose to quietly match the effort you're actually receiving, reaching out only as often as they do, and letting the relationship find its honest, natural level instead of the inflated one you'd been propping up alone. None of these choices are wrong. What's wrong is continuing to hand out the busy excuse indefinitely, without ever checking whether it still holds up against the actual evidence sitting in your own message history. If you choose the direct route, naming what you've noticed instead of just quietly adjusting your own effort, keep it simple and free of accusation, because the goal is information, not a fight. Something like, "I've noticed I'm usually the one reaching out first, and I wanted to ask how you're feeling about that," opens the door honestly without cornering anyone. Their answer, and just as importantly, how they answer, tends to tell you almost everything. A response that leads to real change, more initiating, more visible effort, is worth taking seriously. A response that produces one good week, followed by a slow return to the exact same pattern, is worth taking just as seriously in the opposite direction. It's worth being careful here about one specific trap. This process is not about turning every quiet week into an interrogation or treating a single instance of them not texting first as proof of anything. One data point is never the pattern. The entire point of tracking over months, rather than reacting to any single week, is to avoid punishing someone for an ordinary busy stretch that has nothing to do with how they actually feel about you. The goal is clarity, not suspicion, and clarity requires looking at the whole picture, not the most recent 5 days of it. Here's the harder question underneath all of this. If the pattern is this easy to spot, why do so many people keep making excuses for it, sometimes for years, long after the evidence has clearly stopped supporting the excuse they keep repeating? Because the alternative is uncomfortable in a very specific way. Accepting that someone simply isn't prioritizing you means facing a version of reality where you don't get to control the outcome through more effort, more patience, more understanding. As long as busy remains the explanation, there's still a story where things could change, where the right circumstances might finally free up the time that's apparently been missing this whole time. Admitting the real reason means giving up that story, and giving up a hopeful story, even an inaccurate one, feels harder than simply continuing to believe it. This is why so many people keep initiating month after month, year after year, even when some quiet part of them already suspects the truth. Reaching out first, again, feels safer than confronting the silence directly and finding out what it actually means. But the reaching out doesn't fix anything. It just delays the moment the truth becomes impossible to avoid, while the actual imbalance keeps repeating itself in the meantime, unnoticed by nobody except the one person still doing all the reaching. There's also a quieter belief hiding underneath this habit for a lot of people, one worth naming honestly. Somewhere along the way, some people learn that being the one who initiates is simply their role in every relationship without exception, and that this role reflects something true about their own worth rather than something specific to any one relationship. If that belief runs deep enough, it doesn't matter how much evidence accumulates that a specific person isn't reciprocating. The habit of reaching out first keeps running anyway, because stopping doesn't just risk this one relationship. It risks confronting a much older, much more painful question about why initiating has always felt like the only role available. Recognizing this doesn't mean the pattern is your fault, or that noticing it means you did something wrong all these years. It simply means the habit of over-initiating might be worth examining on its own, separately from any one specific person, because it may be showing up in more relationships than just this one, quietly training people around you, without any of them ever having to ask to let you carry all the weight of staying connected. If any of this is landing, it's worth doing something small and concrete today instead of just nodding along. Open your messages with the specific person who came to mind while watching this. Scroll back 3 months. Count, honestly, who started each conversation. The number itself will usually tell you more than any explanation you've been offering on their behalf for years. You were never wrong to want to be reached out to. That desire isn't neediness, and it isn't asking for too much. It's simply the ordinary hope that someone who matters to you finds you worth the same 10 seconds you've always been willing to give them. If that hope keeps going unanswered month after month, through busy seasons and quiet ones alike, the problem was never your standards. It was the story you kept telling yourself to avoid looking directly at what the silence was actually saying. Busy is not a character flaw, and nobody owes you constant contact simply for existing in their life. But a genuine, ongoing pattern of never reaching out first is not busy either. It's a choice, repeated quietly enough and often enough that it stopped looking like one. You get to decide, now that you can see it clearly, whether that choice is one you're willing to keep accepting without ever naming it out loud. Think about the specific name that came to mind while you were watching this, because one probably did almost immediately before this video even got halfway through. That's worth paying attention to on its own. The pattern wasn't hiding. You already knew. This video didn't teach you something new about that relationship. It just gave you permission to stop explaining away something you'd already noticed a long time ago. If this reached you, don't send an angry message about it. Just notice, honestly, the next time you find yourself typing first, again, for the same person, for the 10th or the 50th time. That noticing is where the real clarity begins, long before any conversation ever needs to happen out loud. And if this video meant something to you, the next one goes further into exactly how to have that conversation if you decide it's worth having. I'll see you there.